An accurate assessment decision begins with the individual student, not a disability label, placement, or anticipated score. This course is for IEP team members, special educators, related service providers, administrators, and staff who support ELPAC planning. Our responsibility is to select the assessment and access supports that allow each student to demonstrate English language proficiency as validly as possible. We will connect that decision to accurate IEP documentation and a clear testing handoff. We begin with why these decisions matter beyond the IEP team meeting. The IEP is the bridge between familiar instructional access and correct test implementation. Testing is not a separate event that begins on test day. The team's understanding of how the student accesses instruction and communicates should drive the assessment decision and the resources documented in the IEP. The site coordinator and examiner can only implement what is communicated accurately and early. When the chain breaks, the students may face an inaccessible test or an invalid result, and the site may need to complete corrective work. The first team decision is selecting the correct assessment. The alternate assessment is not the first accommodation considered. Teams first determine whether the student can access the general ELPAC with permitted resources. Begin with the general ELPAC, review accessibility options, and consider access by domain. If a disability prevents access to a particular domain even after permitted resources are considered, the team may need to examine the current domain exemption decision-making tool. Only then, and only for students who meet the state alternate assessment criteria, should the team select the alternate ELPAC. Use multiple sources such as the IEP, instructional performance, communication data, assistive technology information, and other current evidence. Special education eligibility alone never answers the alternate assessment question. Alternate ELPAC is for a narrowly defined population, not for all students receiving special education services. A student may have an IEP and still appropriately take the general ELPAC with appropriate resources. The team must not choose alternate ELPAC solely because of a disability label, placement, low achievement, behavior, limited English proficiency, or expected difficulty with the test. The state guidance directs teams to consider the student's individual characteristics and whether the student has the most significant cognitive disabilities and is unable to take the general assessment even with accessibility resources. The IEP team owns the participation decision and should use the current CDE decision-making tools or worksheets. For many students, the right answer is the general ELPAC with well-matched resources. A resource is effective when it addresses a documented barrier, is permitted for that assessment, and is familiar from instruction. Universal tools are broadly available. Designated supports are selected based on an identified need by educators familiar with the student, and accommodations are reserved for students with an IEP or Section 504 plan and must be documented. The name of a familiar classroom support does not guarantee that the same resource is allowed in every ELPAC domain, so teams must consult the current California Assessment Accessibility Resources Matrix. Avoid vague entries such as all accommodations or as needed. Access also includes how a student receives and expresses communication. Communication is not limited to speech. The team must document how the student receives information and expresses responses. Identify the student's receptive and expressive communication modes, including established AAC or assistive technology. For alternate ELPAC, the examiner should be a trained educator familiar with the student and the student's preferred communication modes. The testing team should not introduce an unfamiliar system on test day or assume that absence of speech means absence of communication. Document the actual device, symbols, access method, or partner-supported practice clearly enough for the examiner to prepare. A domain exemption is a different and much narrower decision. Domain exemption is based on a disability that prevents access to a specific domain, even after appropriate resources are considered. Work domain by domain and use the current CDE domain exemption decision-making tool. An exemption is not used because the student is unlikely to score well, has limited English proficiency, refuses, is absent, or requires additional time and support. The IEP or Section 504 plan must identify the specific domain and individualized rationale. A vague statement such as exempt as needed is not operationally useful. After the meeting, the SETC needs the exact information early enough to enter it into the exemption and select the reason required in TOMS. Because the state guidance was revised for the 2026-2027 school year, always use the current decision-making tool rather than any older or local checklists. The quality of the IEP entry determines whether the decision can be implemented. The IEP must be precise enough for the site testing team to act without interpretation. Name the assessment correctly. Record the individualized rationale. Exact accessibility resources, specific domain exemptions when applicable, and the student's communication modes. Identify how and when the SETC will be notified. Avoid shorthand that transfers the decision to an examiner or coordinator. Per IEP is not a usable instruction if the testing team cannot identify the exact setting. Accurate documentation protects the student, the IEP team, and the validity of the assessment. Two short scenarios show how the evidence changes that decision. Similar labels can lead to different decisions. The deciding factor is the student's complete evidence and access needs. Scenario A describes a student who receives special education services but can participate in the general ELPAC with permitted resources. Scenario B describes a student whose instructional program, communication profile, and multiple sources of evidence support eligibility for an alternate assessment. If you have an alternate assessment for the ELPAC, that student must also have an alternate assessment for the CASP or CAW. These are illustrative scenarios, not eligibility shortcuts. The actual IEP team must complete an individualized review using current evidence. Ask yourself, what evidence would our team cite, not just what box would we check? Once the decision is made, the information must reach everyone responsible for testing. The meeting is not the end of the decision. Implementation requires a timely, verified handoff. The IEP team documents the decision. The case manager communicates it. The SETC verifies assessment eligibilities, settings, trained examiner, and scheduling. The test examiner reviews the student settings and prepares required resources before approving a test session. After testing, new access information should return to the team for future planning. Any conflict between the IEP, TOMS, instructional practice, and materials must be resolved before the student begins a test session. Notify the site ELPAC Testing Coordinator promptly when an IEP team decision affecting the ELPAC or CASP is added or changed. Make an individualized decision, document it precisely, and communicate it before testing. Before the meeting ends, confirm these 6 commitments. The assessment selection must be evidence-based. Accessibility should be considered before alternate participation or domain exemption. Alternate ELPAC is not a special education default. Resources and communication modes must be familiar and precisely documented. Finally, the SETC must receive the information early enough to implement it correctly. The right assessment is the one that evidence supports and the IEP makes possible. Direct any site-specific implementation questions to the Site ELPAC Testing Coordinator. Current resources for IEP teams and other decision makers came from, in this training, Alternate Assessment IEP Team Guidance from the CDE, ELPAC Program Resources and Domain Exemption Tools, also from the CDE, California Assessment Accessibility Resource Matrix, Alternate ELPAC Program Information, and our 26-27 ELPAC Online Test Administration Manuals, also known as an OTAMs. Thank you for your prompt attention to this important video.